Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. My guest today, Ratna Omidvar, is an independent senator from Ontario to the Senate of Canada. She is the author of legislation that is starting to make its way through the Canadian Parliament called the Frozen Assets Repurposing Act. The bill would seize the assets of corrupt and abusive foreign officials and redeploy those assets to the very people harmed by those officials. This includes people displaced by the actions of corrupt and violent regimes. We kick off discussing Senator Omidvar's personal history of displacement before having a longer conversation about the contours of her legislation. We then have an extended discussion about how legislation in Canada can influence other parliaments of liberal democracies around the world. I must say, this is a very interesting discussion about a very worthwhile Canadian initiative. And if you're a parliamentarian around the world who is working on legislation that you think might be of interest and of impact to this globally focused audience of podcast listeners, reach out to me. You can do so using the contact button on globaldispatchespodcast.com. That's how I got in touch with Senator Omidvar for this very fascinating conversation. Also, if you're listening to this episode contemporaneously, it means I'm currently in Ghana on a reporting trip examining the intersection of big data and the Sustainable Development Goals. I should have some episodes from this trip in the near future, so stay tuned. And for now, here is my conversation with Senator Ratna Omidvar.
When I was much younger, I went to university in West Germany, and I met my partner for life there. He was a foreign student like me. He was from Iran, and after we completed our education, we decided to go live in Iran. This was 1974. I guess we could not have chosen a more exciting or a more dangerous time, because 6 short years later, we were forced to pack our bags overnight and flee, because if we had stayed in Iran, our lives would have been in some significant and immediate danger. So I've always had this empathy and this concern for people who have no choice but to leave their homes, because staying becomes a real risk to their lives. And when we left, I remember trying to figure out what I could take in the one bag that I could take with me, and it was paralyzing. And I now think instead of the 70 million people who are displaced in the world, who in one way or the other have an experience much, much, much worse than mine, because I was able to get to safety, and I was able to come to Canada and create a life for myself and my family, whereas the people who are displaced today, in most cases, are bereft of hope and bereft of choice. There are generations that know of no other existence than the existence of displacement. And I think this is a problem that is not local or regional or national. It is a global problem. It is a problem for all of us in the world, and we have to use different ways of addressing the problem, and this is what my proposal is about.
So your experience, as you said, informed your decision to table the Frozen Assets Repurposing Act, which will be the focus of our conversation. So can you introduce listeners to what this act intends to do and what it says?
This act will seize the assets of corrupt foreign officials and who have chosen to locate their money in safe jurisdictions like Canada, and through a process that will be transparent and open and accountable, those assets will be redeployed back to serve the people who have been harmed the most. And in many cases, one can draw a direct line between those who are displaced, They're corrupt and violent regimes who have created the displacement and the corruption of these very same individuals in stealing from the people, from the country, and placing their assets in safety in a third jurisdiction. So in this way, by following the money, we will hold them accountable and provide a small measure of justice to the people who have been harmed the most.
So my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that your act sort of builds on what's known as the Magnitsky Act, in that, which was sort of a human rights legal movement that was really, I think, started here in the United States, but has become a global movement. And Canada has its own sort of version of the Magnitsky Act. But could you just describe what that act says, what it does, and how it empowers governments like the United States, like the government of Canada, to seize the assets of, bad guys abroad?
So the Magnitsky Act is an act which names corrupt foreign officials and does two things. It prevents them from ever entering the country. In your case, the United States, in our case, Canada. There are two other jurisdictions who have signed on and have versions of their own Magnitsky Act, that is the UK and Estonia. So there are four in the mix.
Estonia, okay.
Estonia, right.
There you go, yes.
Estonia.
No friend of Russian overreach. Okay.
Exactly. But every country has its own version. So in the U.S., it is an act that only covers, I believe, individuals from Russia, whereas
I think here in the U.S. it was amended a few years ago to include.
It was
more.
Amended.
Yeah. But initially, we should say, initially, this guy Magnitsky was an accountant, I believe, in Russia, who was investigating corruption of Russian oligarchs, but ended up, murdered in prison. And the initial piece of legislation, which I think was in 2012, would sanction those found to be directly responsible for his death. But it's been broadened, yeah.
That was Serge Magnitsky, and of course the story, as documented by Bill Browder, is gripping in its detail and in the way it exposes corruption and oppression in Russia. The Magnitsky Act in Canada always applied to corrupt foreign officials anywhere in the world. But here's what all Magnitsky Acts do. They freeze the assets. They do not seize them and redeploy them back to help the people who were the victims. And what freezing does is it ties up the assets, often for very, very long time. And meanwhile, countries who are trying to manage with an unexpected influx of millions of people into their countries. Think of Bangladesh from Myanmar. More than 920,000 Rohingya refugees are now in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. And Bangladesh is left coping with whatever little it has to spare, plus whatever little the UN and the UNHCR has to spare. So this act, let's call it the Magnitsky Plus, would go the next step. It would not just freeze, it would seize and redeploy the assets back to the source country, or to another country, or to another institution. And this would all be determined in the case of the Canadian law. If it is passed, it would be determined in the fullness of transparency by a Canadian court and not by politicians.
Mm-hmm. So the court would be able to sort of adjudicate where the seized assets would go, whether it would go to the UN Refugee Agency or to local NGOs working on the ground in places.
Exactly. And the Canadian court would call witnesses, it would give notice, it would do all the things that our system, which are not dissimilar to liberal systems in the rest of the world, would go through all the steps and processes before it reaches a decision, and would also outline in its decision, exactly as you said, how the money would be spent, how would it be accounted for, who would get it, etc., etc., etc.
How much money are we talking about? Do you have a sense of how much in frozen assets Canada currently holds, for would-be, human rights, abusers around the world?
We actually don't know because we publish the names of the officials who are on the frozen assets list, but we do not actually have a public registry of the value of their assets. So we know that, currently there are 72 plus individuals from a range of jurisdictions on the Canadian sanctions list. And by the way, Canada, like other countries, has legislation beyond Magnitsky legislation. There's the UN Sanctions Act. There are other acts that enable us to freeze the assets of individuals. But we don't know the value of their assets. In this bill, not only would we seize and redeploy, we would also have a public registry of the value of those assets. So for the first time, we'd get to actually know. Now, the government has different ways of knowing. So I'll take us back to a decade before when the government of Muammar Gaddafi fell. We knew at that time that Canada held $2.2 billion worth of Gaddafi's assets in Canada. And in government-to-government negotiations with the then Libyan government, we returned the money. There was no transparency. There were no conditions. We don't actually know exactly how the money was used. And we don't know, in fact, if it was corrupted again. This bill, by making sure that there is a court order in the middle, or as a first step to the seizure, we will provide the accountability and the transparency. And in some way, there's a moral symmetry to this, I think, that is important to appreciate. If you steal money from your people and you then proceed to deprive them of their basic freedoms, there will be accountability.
So when crafting this law, did you look to any other foreign governments that have similar laws on the books?
Yes. And fascinatingly enough, we discovered a law in Switzerland.
That's like the last place I would have thought.
Exactly. Or maybe the first place.
Yeah, I suppose.
Because of their reputation with
the Swiss bankers, Swiss bank accounts,
all of they probably had a reputational issue they were wanting to deal with. But in 2015, they enacted an act. It was called the Foreign Illicit Assets Act, which allowed for assets that were deposited in Switzerland by corrupt foreign officials to be confiscated and restituted. And there is actually a case that I know of where Switzerland returned assets to Kazakhstan following a criminal bribery case that was decided on in Switzerland. And because they didn't want to return the money to Kazakhstan itself, they set up an independent non-profit foundation to monitor the return of the assets.
Okay, so
this
works.
Was involved,
yeah,
and other NGOs were involved. So there is some precedent.
There's some proof of concept.
Yeah, proof of concept is there.
So forgive me, sort of my ignorance of the Canadian legislative process, and forgive me doubly for the fact that I actually am Canadian. So I should know
forgiveness. Blessings only for being a Canadian.
Okay. I've never lived there. I've never worked there, but I am a citizen of Canada. I just don't know how a senator's proposal becomes a law. Can you sort of talk me through the process, the procedures? How will what you have written become legislation? And sort of what are some of the political obstacles to its becoming adopted?
The way legislation from a senator, and perhaps your listeners would appreciate that I'm not an elected official, I'm an appointed official, but I do have legislative making powers that have to be approved through the whole gamut of legislation making. So I've tabled this bill in the Senate. It will hopefully go to committee in the Senate. It will come back from committee in the Senate after we've heard from witnesses, including human rights groups and ambassadors and foreign officials. when it comes back to the Senate after committee, we will debate it again. There may be amendments to it, and then hopefully it gets approved. If it gets approved, it has to then go over to the other part of Parliament Hill. We are a bicameral Parliament Hill here. So it would go to the House of Commons, which is the elected house, and would go through the same process again. Tabling of the legislation by a member of the House of Parliament, second reading, committee, third reading, amendments, and final approval. So there are two very articulated separate processes in two separate chambers on Parliament Hill that go through this. And this is all, part of our system, part of our Constitution, and it assures that nothing in haste is done, that bills are debated, are consulted on, that civil society and other organizations weigh in, and then it becomes law.
So can you talk a little bit about maybe the broader politics of this? I mean, you're proposing taking money out of the Treasury, I have to imagine.
I'm not proposing.
Okay.
No,
that's right. So it's frozen.
Not a single dollar will come from our Treasury or from any other jurisdiction's treasury. It will come from the corrupt foreign officials. So there is money to be distributed, and whenever there is money to be distributed, there are constituencies that vie for a piece of that pie in any sort of political system. That's sort of like a given. So, like, what are some of the broader political forces informing how this piece of legislation might proceed? Well, you're absolutely right. When anything worth any value is seized by a government, there are people who will line up. They may have a personal interest in it. The country where it was stolen from may have an interest in getting it back. Family members may lay a claim to it. So this is where the court review will be incredibly useful. So there's a process issue here, but you've asked a political issue. I believe that like-minded jurisdictions, like the people we are talking to, hopefully in Germany and other parts, Sweden, Norway, hopefully the UK, will look at the broader political implications for addressing displacement, which I know displacement occurs in miles away, far away from our borders, but we are connected in a way we were never connected before. It does have implications. So it is in the political interest of Canada, at least, and I hope other countries, to look at this legislation with a view from a view not just of human rights legislation, but justice and accountability as well for the individuals who've stolen the money.
I mean, what's interesting, to me about this, specifically for the purposes of supporting agencies and groups that focus on displacement issues, is, you're potentially talking about like a lot of money. I mean, earlier you said, $2 billion was, returned to Libya, was seized. Yeah. You also said we don't really know how much money Canada has in frozen assets of foreign corrupt people, but we do know that I think the UN Refugee Agency's budget is something like $7 billion. So even like $1 billion from Canada alone is a gigantic sum of money for the global refugee crisis. And one wonders if these chronically underfunded UN agencies and humanitarian organizations might find this as like an innovative source of financing for their operations in the future.
The World Bank has come up with an interesting statistic. There are roughly $20 to $40 billion worth of stolen money that can be traced back to corrupt public officials. So that's a huge amount of money. If we get even $1 billion, I'm going to put that, and provide it to the humanitarian relief agencies of the world, who are never, ever able to reach 100% of their budget. The UNHCR has ever only been able to reach 60% of its budget because it is financed by voluntary contributions. Mm-hmm. And the displaced people of the world, I think, cannot simply sit around and wait for charity in a way. This is, in a sense, their money to help them in their moment of crisis.
So, what comes next? What should we around the world, people around the world listen to this show? What should we be looking at in the future when it comes to this piece of legislation?
I think I would like to hope that the people in the world will think about it both aspirationally and pragmatically. Aspirationally, it provides justice. Justice to those who appear to act with immunity. Think of those generals in Myanmar, those warlords in South Sudan. They squirrel away millions of dollars. Their names are on our sanctions list, but we don't do anything with their money. On a pragmatic level, it gets money to the agencies, to the NGOs. In one case, it could be the UN. In another case, it could be Médecins Sans Frontières, who are doing the work that is required to be done on the field to help the people who are impacted. So I'm hoping that people will think about it as a move that is grounded in justice and accountability, but with a healthy dose of pragmatism attached to it.
And as you said earlier, I mean, if Canada does adopt this, I have to imagine that other countries around the world would similarly want to model that legislation.
Precisely. Canada has, has a reputation of being, some people call it the gold standard in these issues. But I think we have to keep aspiring to look at new instruments, new ways, and new mechanisms of addressing a problem that is catalytic in its proportion. 70 million displaced people in the world. There are 70 million reasons to do this, and to do this not just as individual nation states, which I'm proposing to do in Canada, but build a community around this notion. And the proposal will always look different in different countries. There will always be some variation, as there is with Magnitsky, but the intent should hold us together.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Senator. This is absolutely fascinating. I love seeing these envelope pushing pieces of legislation, and I'll be curious to see where this ends up. But thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, sir. I really appreciated it.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Senator Omidvar. So there's this joke in journalism circles. It's sort of like apocryphal by now, but the story goes that some editors and writers, I think it was like at the New Republic, were having a contest, sitting around the table, trying to think of the most boring headline they could, and the winner of the contest was the headline, "Worthwhile Canadian Initiative." However, if there ever was a worthwhile Canadian initiative, it is the Frozen Assets Repurposing Act. Thanks all for listening. We'll see you next time. Bye.